Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with a small print, and today my guest is Matt Ridley, who many of you will know is the author of The Red Queen and more recently Viral, The Search for the Origins of COVID-19, which he co-wrote with another author. Matt, as always with our guests on this show, we like to start by asking you to introduce yourself, though, the way you would prefer to be introduced.
My name's Matt Ridley. I'm a writer, and I write almost exclusively about science, technology, and progress. I've written a number of books, as you say, and I was a scientist. I've also been a member of the House of Lords in the UK in the Parliament.
Fantastic. I think that's a great way to start, because a lot of your writing has been actually sort of interrogating a bit of what goes on in the scientific community and perhaps interrogating some of those ideas about what science really is. So let's start with that before I put words into your mouth. How would you actually describe the process of science, or what it is right now to you?
Yes, well, I think I'm increasingly concerned about the difference between science as an institution and science as a philosophy. Science as a philosophy means basing your knowledge of the world entirely on evidence, whether that has been acquired through experiment or observation, and has been properly tested and found to be replicable and true. Science as an institution is increasingly a profession which practices the business of spending money on experiments in laboratories and so on, and to some extent nowadays worries me by the degree to which it closes ranks against dissenters, insists on a consensus view, which is very much not the way science operates. Science operates by challenging consensuses. And this isn't true everywhere. Science is still working fine, and it's a great institute. I think it's the greatest human achievement, bar none. But I do worry when it says there is the science which you must all believe and something else which you mustn't. And I think that's an important distinction we need to remember.
Yes, absolutely. The distinction between science and the science, or the scientific consensus, is critical to having any sort of debate. And particularly at this point in time, where we seem to be finding ourselves on very unsteady ground, and that the very understanding of what base sort of consensus on any sorts of reality is kind of under attack. And unless we have some sort of common agreement of some foundational facts, how are we then able to challenge each other's ideas and push back on things? When we sort of start replacing testing and evidence-based processes of agreement with this concept of consensus, which I find really, really fascinating, because consensuses usually seem to be a good thing. But consensus does not necessarily mean consent on the one hand, and consensus doesn't actually mean fact either. And I find myself having these sorts of debates all the time, whether it's about actual sort of the science or science type conversations, or whether we start getting into conversations around the world of decentralization and DeFi. This concept of consensus, I think, has been horribly maligned in popular discourse, and that the concept of the sort of scientific peer review was there for a very good reason, but it should not really be confused with the idea of just getting a bunch of people in a room and finding out what the majority thinks and turning that into some sort of a fact TM or the scientific consensus. Do you have any comments on that and how we can avoid or at least better articulate the distinction between something like a peer-reviewed consensus and this concept of consensus equals truth, which is a subtlety, but I think an important foundational distinction?
Yes, I think that it's a very good point that you make. And yes, we can have a consensus that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow. What we can't have a consensus about is what the right policy for dealing with COVID-19 is. There are disagreements. Was lockdown a good idea? Have the vaccines worked as well as we'd hoped? There are lots of questions which need proper debate. Are masks effective? The evidence is ambiguous. Some people say yes, some people say no. It's more important in uncertainty. And when we're dealing with the unknown, we're always dealing with uncertainty, to tolerate disagreement. And I think this is where we've gone wrong in recent years on certain issues, including climate change, including COVID-19. We've said There's only one way of thinking about it, and you mustn't depart from that. Because what's happened in the past is that Professor A has come up with a theory about something and has gathered evidence that he thinks backs up that theory, that supports that theory. But he's probably ignored some evidence that doesn't support that theory. And he says, well, yeah, but, I don't really believe that evidence because of, he's got a bias, in other words. We all have it. It's called confirmation bias. We look for the evidence that supports our views and we ignore the evidence that doesn't support our views. But what keeps science honest, what makes it incredibly effective at getting at the truth, is that Professor B comes along and points out that there's some evidence that Professor A is wrong. And they have a row. And that's fine. That's good. Disagreement is perfectly healthy. And eventually the world decides that Professor A was right and Professor B was wrong, or vice versa. And so for me, it's very important that we don't insist that Professor A and Professor B both sign up to a catechism they can agree on. We allow them to disagree. And that's where I think we've gone wrong during the pandemic to some extent. For example, we were told to rule out the possibility that the virus came out of a laboratory incident very early on. We were told that was a conspiracy theory, it was nonsense. We were told that on the basis of very flimsy evidence, we now know. We were told that against the views of senior scientists in private at the time. We found that out from emails recently. Now, I'm not here to say it did come out of a laboratory. Alina Chan and I, my co-author, have written a book saying both outcomes are still possible. It might have been a natural spillover, it might have been a laboratory incident, but we actually now, having looked at all the evidence, we lean towards the laboratory leak.
That's a very good point. And I think it does come back to that sort of idea that science is supposed to kind of converge on the truth, but it can very seldom actually say that it's actually arrived at it. You've always got to be able to update your assumptions based on the new evidence that comes into the picture. And I think that touches on perhaps one of the issues of this whole conversation, where we have made a very fundamental mistake in society of conflating agreement with ideas of morality, and almost saying that people are either right or wrong or good or bad, depending on what their preferred hypothesis is for various different sort of considerations, which is a very interesting idea. But this whole concept of, I think, morality and the questions and the sort of tiptoeing around it is definitely something that seems to get a bit closer at where we seem to have gone wrong with these conversations. It's very reminiscent of ideas from the church, and I certainly have had my own enough experience in and around such religious institutions to know these concepts of like morality filtering into the realm of science don't tend to end well, because it gets people not only to have or to support their biases that you talk about, it almost forces you to sort of dig ditches around that and makes it very, very difficult to overcome any sort of new information that comes in and changes, or at least should change, how you are actually addressing a situation. I think that's quite fascinating. I certainly know that you have been on the receiving end of a lot of that criticism for your work, where it becomes a question not just about the validity of the work or the ideas that you're putting forward or the hypotheses that you're testing. It becomes a personal criticism. Are you a good person or are you a bad person? Do you believe in the science or are you a dissenter, a heretic? So I know it's slightly off topic, but I just wanted to get your view on that. I mean, you've clearly been playing this game for some time, and you have been quite steadfast in your standing up for science as a philosophy and as a process. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that and how difficult it's been to actually deal with that. Of course, now 2 years later, as sort of the truth does reveal itself, sunlight does tend to disinfect even the most tangled of conversations. But having actually been one of the few figures who has stayed steadfast in actually questioning and pushing back and following the process rather than following the consensus, on a personal level, how difficult has it been to actually deal with that?
It is tricky, you're right, because I find myself on the side of the scientific majority in some cases. For example, I'm in favor of vaccines, I'm in favor of genetically modified crops, to step outside COVID for a moment. And sometimes I find myself in a scientific minority. For example, I think that the possibility that this virus came out of a laboratory needs to be taken very seriously indeed. And so you're right that quite often what happens today, not just on social media, is that I am told I am wrong. And they don't mean just factually wrong, they mean morally wrong. And I find that weird. For example, if I'm wrong that the virus might have come out of a laboratory, and it turns out that it didn't, it was the result of a market-based event, then yes, I have maligned scientists by saying we need to check on their procedures to check that there wasn't an incident in the lab and that they weren't doing experiments that were too dangerous, etc., etc. Yes, you can say I've maligned someone. But if I'm wrong the other way, to say that it might have come out of a market, then I've maligned some food handlers, some wildlife traders, some restaurant owners, or wherever it might have happened. So I simply don't see that there is that it is right to get on your moral high horse about an issue like this either way. It's a factual question that we need to answer. And if there's any morality involved, it is in owing something to the millions of people who've died and to the people who are facing future pandemics to take seriously all plausible hypotheses and investigate them credibly. That's where the morality comes in my view, is to be open-minded and to look into everything. And yes, there's been some vicious criticism of Alina Chan and me for even considering the possibility that there might have been an incident in a laboratory. And that seems to us unfair, because in our book, we actually, towards the end, we set out in 2 separate chapters the case for a natural spillover and the case for a laboratory incident. We literally present it as a lawyer speaking to a jury, saying, look, here's the best case I can make for the defense, here's the best case I can make for the prosecution. So we think we're fair to both possibilities. We're letting the reader decide. We are clear that we think the laboratory incident now looks more likely, but we don't claim to have perfect knowledge. So that doesn't seem to me to be morally the wrong thing to be doing. It feels morally the right thing to be doing, to be open-minded.
Absolutely. I have read your book, and I do agree that your case that you lay out there is very fairly presented. It comes across as being objective rather than subjective, which is very difficult wading into the sort of waters that we are right now. Where, to kind of go back to where you sort of started answering my question there, in that you say that quite often you find yourself on the side of the scientific consensus, sometimes you find yourself somewhere else. I think that that's the most dangerous pressure of all, that we constantly advised and nudged towards taking the whole package, to being clearly on one side rather than another. And society doesn't seem to know what to do with people who don't swallow the whole package from any sort of division or binary division across our society. So that's why I do appreciate your take, in that you're not playing to a particular gallery, because that's of course the other thing. You can start to fall into the trap of becoming a professional contrarian, in which case you do start wading closer to the dangers of the waters of conspiracy theorizing, which is another thing I wanted to address with you, because the whole concept of conspiracy theory also is, I think, much like the idea of science and the science, quite a maligned concept, in that it's only a conspiracy theory really when it turns out that it's not true. And if things are updating all the time, if evidence is changing, sometimes ideas that were too dangerous to even question, which is in itself a very dangerous idea, to be in a point of time in society where asking questions makes you a sort of persona non grata. It's already a bit of a problem there. But what I really did enjoy, it's the same time that I read your book, there's a lady on Twitter who I'm not going to mention, who sort of has positioned herself as being the foremost academic studying conspiracy theories. And around about a year ago, she published a triangle that she had the de facto sort of ranking of different degrees of danger and conspiracy. And right at the top was like, you're a danger to yourself and others. And as you sort of filter down the triangle, you get to the point of plausible, but probably a bit mad and crazy. And she sort of categorized all the famous conspiracy theories into her little system. What I find very amusing is that the same week I was reading your book, she had just published an update to her 2020 edition of her own conspiracy pyramid. And to the eagle-eyed sort of viewer or follower of this, it was quite amusing to note the omissions in the updated edition, and also a few additions where words had been changed, as even in the course of just 12 months, some conspiracies that she had labeled as being a danger to yourself and others had actually been proven to be true. One of the more sort of light-hearted ones, so I don't want to go too far into sort of the naming and shaming debacle, would be the concept of the Free Britney conspiracy. On the 2020 edition, she had said that the idea that Britney was being held captive by her father was a conspiracy theory. And obviously, in the year that followed, that turned out to be not just not a conspiracy theory, but actually a judgment that took place in a court that sort of proved that that was not a theory, it was in fact a fact. And the lab question, the lab hypothesis, was also one that had changed. So in the early edition, I think it had been phrased as that even considering COVID came from a lab was a mad conspiracy that made you a danger to yourself and others. In other words, according to her, you yourself, Matt, would have been branded very dangerous man to society. But on the updated version, she changed the language to say it was designed in a lab by humans, but using the word intent in there, sort of slipped that in there. Yes, I think that's a fascinating example of how things go from absolutely taboo towards accepted fact, or at least accepted conversation quite quickly. Yes. And I thought that was really, really amusing, especially in light of the evidence you put forward in your book, because I'd obviously followed this conversation and had conversations with friends and family saying, you can't shut off possibilities, we don't know. You have to, maybe it's a low probability, maybe it's a high probability, but you can't brand things that we don't have full access to the facts of as being impossible. I mean, like even Sherlock Holmes taught us that, right? Mm-hmm. Like you got to eliminate the impossible, and what you're left with could be possible, even if it is not the definitive truth, until you've finished eliminating all those other possibilities too. But I do find it fascinating, this concept that by simply asking questions, that you can actually be branded a cancelable character in today's society, which I really do think is very, very fascinating.
Well, I've spent a lot of my career wrestling with this issue, and actually I find it very difficult still to know when I'm definitely looking at a nutty conspiracy theory and when I'm not. Yes, there are some cases where it's not difficult to tell. The idea that the vaccines are Bill Gates's attempt to implant microchips in every one of us, or that the virus was caused by the 5G phone network. I can reject those very quickly, and I can also notice that the people supporting those ideas are not opening their minds to contrary evidence. They're only looking at things that are consistent with their belief, and they're building castles in the sky out of this kind of stuff. And at the other extreme, I can look at the evidence for respectable scientific theories, like that this is a coronavirus and that it originated in bats, that its closest relative is a virus that inhabits horseshoe bats, as all SARS-like coronaviruses do. That's a perfectly good theory with tons of good evidence for it. I'm not going to, in no way am I ever going to label that a conspiracy theory, even if you can show me some tiny bit of doubt about some part of it. So at those extremes, it's easy. But when you get in the middle and you start coming across ideas that are a bit wacky, probably wrong, but you need to go down that rabbit hole a little bit just to find out where the problem is, where the hole, where there's a brick wall at the end of the rabbit hole. And that's a weird metaphor, but there you go. Or on the other hand, theories that, actually that seems quite plausible, but maybe I ought to just be a little cautious before I say it's true, because it looks good, but it might just be correlation, and correlation doesn't always mean causation. So let me try and give you an example here of that kind of thing. The role of vitamin D in this pandemic. There are people out there saying vitamin D is a crucial part of the body's immune system. When it's deficient, your immune system doesn't work so well. You are more likely to die if you catch the coronavirus. And there are other people saying don't be ridiculous. Vitamin D is not a magic bullet. You can't cure people by giving them a vitamin D pill. And I sort of agree with both those views, actually. I don't think it's a magic bullet. I don't think people who've got enough vitamin D in their system because they're, living in a sunny climate like yours, are, because vitamin D is made by sunlight falling on the skin, can do any good by adding to their vitamin D. But I think darker skinned people in very cloudy, very far northern places where there's not much ultraviolet light in winter can measurably be shown to have significantly lower vitamin D levels in their blood than they should have, and probably should be taking supplements. And that might make the difference between them going to hospital or not if they catch COVID. So it's not a conspiracy theory to say vitamin D matters, but nor is it a panacea that's going to solve all our problems. Yeah. Excuse me.
Yeah, exactly. You've always got to take these things and ask a few questions. I think probably one of the best principles to address most of these things from is by asking the question, what evidence would I need to be presented with in order to change my mind? And if nothing could change your mind, then you probably are a conspiracy theorist one way or another. But if there is something that could be presented to you to say, yes, this is actually, this would actually prove that to be either true or false, then you've got something to work with. And we're back to the realm of science.
You're dead right.
Again to the realm of asking questions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a very good way of spotting whether you're going down a rabbit hole or not. I agree. And in the case of the virus, we've been very clear that if we can find an animal for sale in a market before November 2019, and there is data going back there that was carrying a 99% similar virus to this one, and it came from a farm in southern China where bats lived, and the animals in that farm are getting infected, then case closed. We've found the problem, and it's just like SARS. It came through the food chain. If, on the other hand, we can find that one of the viruses being studied in the Wuhan Institute of Virology and in their database, which has never been made public, is a 99% cousin of SARS-CoV-2, and there is a log book of work in that lab showing that they were working on it in a biosecurity level 2 lab in October 2019, say, then case closed. We know how the pandemic started. And by the way, we know how pretty well every outbreak of an emerging disease happened in the last few decades, whether it's Hendra in Australia or Nipah in Malaysia or hantavirus, Lassa virus, SARS, MERS. We've got a pretty good idea how each of them started, with one glaring exception, and that's SARS-CoV-2, COVID, which happened in an era when we have fantastically good technology for detecting these things, for sequencing viruses, for tracing the origins of variants and things like that, which we never had before. The technology is much superior to what we've had even 10 years ago, and yet we haven't been able to solve this problem of where this virus came from. And one of the things that bothers me is the lack of curiosity about this. There doesn't seem to be any research going on to continue tracing animals in farms in southern China, or to continue investigating what happened in laboratories in Wuhan. It seems to me vital we do both of those.
I would absolutely agree. We have to get as many answers as we possibly can. It's only by accumulating more information that we can make better choices going forward. And we really went into this whole thing eyes very, very blind. So people have obviously made policy choices that have been more successful and less successful. Unfortunately, they won't be, as you said, either falsifiable or proved right with time, because there was pretty much no control group. But the more information we have, the more prepared we can be for whatever comes next. And of course, we can't predict the future, but we can always go into it better prepared with the more information we have, but only to the extent that we are courageous enough to ask and answer questions that we might not actually like to find the answers to. So my sort of personal theory here, hopefully not a conspiracy theory, but a theory just based on human nature, is that perhaps we've fallen into the trap of the noble lie, good old Plato's noble lie. And of course, lies come in two flavors. They come in the lie of commission and the lie of omission. And while it is borderline conspiracy theory to start talking about the deliberate cover-up, which you go to great pains in your book to actually say this is probably not what happened, there is, I think, a reasonable amount of evidence to point to the fact that perhaps there have been lies of omission. In other words, like you're saying, a wanton lack of curiosity to get to the bottom of threads and stories and rabbit holes that might not lead to a politically or socially palatable place. Particularly given the sort of fraughtness of the global trade situation at the moment, there are very real political reasons for not wanting to rock international boats and for not wanting people to question the validity of science. And of course, we were speaking earlier about the difference between science and the science, but there is a worry, and it's a real worry, because trust is a very tricky thing, and particularly in times of crisis, public sector leaders in particular have to try and get the trust of their societies behind them. And as soon as any doubt comes in about science, whether this thing did escape from a lab under the watch of the scientific community, it does add more distrust into already distrustful environment about other aspects of science. Because unfortunately, like we were saying earlier, science has become conflated into good people and bad people, insiders and outsiders. And there's almost a sense that any sort of criticism of the scientific community, even if it was just a pure accident or a lack of attention to detail in terms of safety, or just error, an accident, these things happen. It also undermines, for a certain subset of the population, other messages that the scientific community, backed up by political leaders, are trying to get across. And you spoke a bit earlier about vaccines. Unfortunately, these conversations all converge. On almost all ends of the spectrum, people that believe in one thing tend to believe in another thing, particularly around this COVID crisis. Yes. You've kind of got two groups. And people that are more likely to believe in a lab leak hypothesis, also due to human nature and tribalism and polarization and the way our world is set up, also more likely to believe in perhaps more conspiracy type theories around things about vaccines, around things about population control, around things about science being bad. Again, it comes back to this concept of morality, good people and bad people, insiders and outsiders. Which side am I on? So sort of noble lie of omission is a concept I'll be playing around with in my head that does kind of explain that lack of curiosity that is so frustrating to anyone that wants to get to the bottom of truth, because I think there are real political drivers and incentives in order to lean into ignorance. I don't know if you have any advice, I don't know if you agree with what I'm saying there at all, or if you have any advice as to how we can break out of those cycles and how we can make asking questions sexy again.
You're dead right. And as an example, a few weeks ago, we got to know the content of some emails that we had known existed but had been fully redacted for months. And these are emails between Anthony Fauci, the chief medical advisor in the United States, Jeremy Farrar, the head of the Wellcome Trust in the UK, Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health in America, and a number of other senior virologists. And what they show is that while Dr. Fauci was telling the Trump administration to rule out the possibility of a laboratory leak altogether, and Jeremy Farrar was signing a letter to the Lancet saying that this was nonsense, in private, they were saying, and they were hearing from other senior virologists, that it was very likely that it was a laboratory leak. Now, they say they changed their minds. So what's the problem? That's what scientists are supposed to do. But they seem to have changed their minds within days, very quickly. And because of the emails that we've now seen, we've got a hint as to why they changed their minds. They say it will be damaging to the reputation of science and international harmony. Now, that is not a scientific reason. It's a political reason. And of course, looming in the background here is we don't want to say anything that proves Donald Trump to be right. So there's obviously a party political side to this too, but that isn't stated explicitly. So maybe I'm being unfair in suggesting that that was a motivation. But we all know, that most of the establishment would be only too delighted to see Donald Trump contradicted in February of 2020. And yes, he was going too far in some of his statements, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty clear there was a political reason. Now, when challenged, they also say, well, it was the pangolins that made us change our minds. Two problems with that. The pangolin press conference didn't happen until the 7th of February. We know they changed their minds by the 4th of February when they were drafting a paper saying they could rule it out. And secondly, we know the pangolin data is a red herring. The pangolin virus is only 90% the same as SARS-CoV-2. It can't be the source of the pandemic. There were no pangolins for sale in Wuhan. There were only 3 infected pangolins with this virus, and they were 1,000 miles away. And nearly all the other pangolins that have been tested are not carrying this virus. So somehow some smuggled pangolins picked up a similar virus, but they didn't pick up this virus. So it's a red herring. So if anything, the pangolins turning out to be irrelevant should have made people like Fauci and Farah go back and say, okay, well, we need to go back to our previous idea, which was that it's quite likely that it did come out of a laboratory, and not just as a result of an accident, but as a result of an experiment to manipulate a virus to make it slightly more infectious in the lab in order to be able to grow it, which is what the furin cleavage site debate is all about. So here we have an example of scientists adopting a position that appears to be for scientific and political, for political and reputational reasons rather than scientific reasons. And notice that if they're wrong, if we do eventually get good evidence this started in a laboratory, the damage to scientists' reputation will be far worse for the fact that they wouldn't investigate it, they wouldn't consider the possibility, they called it a conspiracy theory, because then it contaminates the whole of science. Whereas if they'd said, look, this is a significant possibility, we don't like to dump on our Chinese colleagues here, but could we please ask them to show us what's in their database, show us what experiments they were doing, show us what viruses they were working on, tell us whether any of their colleagues went to hospital in November 19. All of this information has been denied to us at the moment. But if science itself had said, we want to investigate this possibility in order to rule it out, we're the ones who should be asking to see this database because we think it's going to prove science to be innocent. Instead of which they're saying, let's not investigate, don't you dare ask these questions, which only feeds the, I'm trying to avoid the words conspiracy theory here, but feeds the antagonism of the people who hate all biotechnology, who think all science is evil. And it puts people like me, who've defended science for 40 or 50 years and championed it, rather on the back foot now, when we say, look, science is basically good, it does wonderful things, but in this case, it seems to have made a mistake. That's the line I want to take. It's getting much harder to take that line because of the scientific establishment refusing to investigate itself and leaving it to its enemies to investigate it.
Absolutely. That's the problem with any sort of noble lie that comes from any sort of hint of paternalism, right? So it works to calm the crowds and to get buy-in or get that desired consensus, as long as you don't get caught out in your lie. If you get caught out in your lie, you end up doing more damage to your reputation and irreparable damage to the much bigger picture of trust, which is a very dangerous point to be, because we are losing, as I said, this bedrock of consistency. I mean, we're at a point in humanity where we're having serious academic debates about the validity of the 1+1 equation. So, by the time you get to that point, that sort of science becomes a mocking, like something that should be justly mocked. And as such, you lose so much of what becomes really important levers in real crises. In real crises, you really do have to get people to believe you that this is a dangerous virus and that you should actually take precautions. But if you've lost that trust, if you become Chicken Little, but the other way sort of around, probably that's a bad metaphor, you can't get people to even believe in actual sense. You lose that ability, and you can't rebuild trust. I think we're going to have lost trust in the scientific establishment for several generations over this crisis. And I'm not saying it's necessarily done by malevolent intent. Of course, there are a few sort of political, cynical actors that would have acted in their own interests. But I think many people have actually contributed to this destruction of science as a concept from quite well-meaning intentions, but without understanding the unseen effects of their short-term choices. I think that's a huge tragedy. And I think it's a huge tragedy that's going to set us back in terms of progress going forward too, not just in terms of trust and sort of social cohesion, which is definitely necessary for any sort of society to progress into the future, but also progress as in actually investing in science going forward. I think that this is going to set us back in terms of our ability to test new ideas, to talk about new ideas, and to get people to really pull together in any sort of common direction. I don't know if you agree with that.
I do completely agree. That's exactly the point I think is crucial here. I think we've seen a lot of damage to the reputation of science here, and some of it is self-inflicted, as I've said. Just on a different level, vaccination is, I think, probably the most beneficial innovation ever invented. From eradicating smallpox to dealing with many, measles and many other killer diseases. It's probably done more good for humankind than any other technology. And to see it come to the point where a lot of anti-vax settlement is growing and growing and growing, partly because we're kind of forcing it down people's throats in a way that doesn't recognize that, yes, there are side effects, not as bad as the disease, but they're not irrelevant, and making it compulsory, it just fires up everybody's opposition to it. And at the same time, we've got this argument about where the virus came from that will lead the very scientists who've been most championing vaccines to have their reputation damaged if it turns out they've been insisting a theory that was insisting it was a conspiracy theory to think that the virus came out of a laboratory. How do I defend Dr. Fauci or someone like that on vaccines if it turns out he's been not entirely open with the public about the origin of the virus? That's my problem.
Yeah. Little lies poison big truths and gives us nothing to work with.
Way of putting it.
You can't have those conversations. Yeah. But while I have you here, I did also want to talk about your previous book, which was The Red Queen did make, I read an impressionable point in my life, I think, when I was trying to reinvent my career and all the rest of it. And I think it fits in nicely with this conversation around progress and stagnating progress. And I did want to run by you a debate that I've been having on Twitter and through various of the books and projects and keynotes and conversations that I have, around how technology has also started to almost become a synthetic Red Queen phenomenon that's been going on in our world of technology at the moment, in terms of progress, in that we are inventing technologies in both the biosphere and in terms of more sort of synthetic hardware, software-based computing program that give us a short-term edge at the expense of long-term efficiency. And this to me is exactly the sort of Red Queen treadmill that you talk about, that evolutionary edge that can give an individual a sharp point, but when the whole crowd adopts it, it actually becomes drag on society. And the classic examples here would be, of course, dating markets. It's much more efficient to get a date via a dating app, but less people are getting into bed with each other, to put it very crudely, these days, and less people are getting married and less people are procreating. So it's more efficient, but it becomes less effective over time, which actually sort of feeds very neatly back into the biological side. My other favorite example there is that the sort of needlessly expended effort in order to maintain our edge would be twofold, where you see the exact same phenomenon unfolding, one intended, one unintended. The one being, of course, Bitcoin. You have to expend ever more energy, very literally, in order to get ever diminishing rewards. But the same thing plays out with even something as simple as search engine optimization and a recipe blog. I mean, if you want to get a recipe to make a cup of tea, you got to wade through a 2,000-word essay in order to get to it, because the poor little blogger that was writing this recipe had to game the search engines into finding her post. And of course, if she does that, the incentive for the next woman to come along is to defect and write a 2,500 word essay before you get to her T essay, which is all completely wasted effort on terms of both the buyer and the seller of information. And we see the same patterns playing out across advertising, across energy, across finance, across really everything. These silly zero-sum games we find ourselves forced into playing because the Nash equilibrium is always for someone to defect and to waste resources as we go forward. I don't know what your thoughts are on that in terms of the more general evolution of our cursed species, as we don't seem to be able to break out of these pointless patterns because the incentives are just not in our favor.
Well, that's fascinating. There's so much food for thought in what you've just said that I feel I would like to read your book on the topic. Have you written it yet? And if not, please do. Because I think you've taken the argument I made in The Red Queen and put it up against an argument I made in The Rational Optimist, which is that the world's been getting better and is likely to go on getting better. And I still think that. I mean, I don't want to throw out either social media or email or Bitcoin or anything. I think most of the Bitcoin, not much, but most of these technologies are doing great benefit to humankind. But you're absolutely right that there is a diminishing returns effect here, and that, I mean, the point about the Red Queen, of course, in Through the Looking Glass, is that the faster she runs, the more she stays in the same place. And I'm reminded, going back to your dating analogy, one of my favorite activities in the springtime here is to go and watch a particular bird that has a communal mating display. It's called the black grouse, and the males are fantastically colorful, black and white and red, and they gather on these sports arenas on top of the hills to beat the hell out of each other for several hours every morning. And the females, who are brown and mousy and well camouflaged, turn up, look completely unimpressed, and eventually mate with the one in the middle of the one who's managed to get the territory in the middle of the arena. And in some sense, this system has evolved from the choosiness of females, we think. The more choosy females are about their mates, the more they decide to go with the one with the best dance or the biggest tail or whatever, the more they will drive the evolution of male plumage in a ridiculous direction and male fighting and so on. And so, in a species where, the females choose males that'll help them bring up the babies, it's different. But where you choose one just based on his display, you're going to end up with this sort of mad system where the poor creature has been evolved into a ludicrous plumage, like, peacocks and all these other things, and is burdened with having to sort of dance manically for hours every morning, and has a, only 1% chance of ever mating at all, but if they do, they get 500 mates, etc. So from the male's point of view, this isn't a great bargain. And I think
it's deformed, right? You're basically deforming yourself in order to stay in the race.
Right.
It's very uneven outputs.
It's like us breeding bulldogs or something like that. Clearly something is happening in the dating game today. Thank God I don't have to date. I'm happily married at 63 years old and have lovely children and things like that. So it's not my scene, and I've no idea what it is actually like. But I gather that it's a bit of a nightmare, because instead of sort of meeting someone, you have to swipe through hundreds of people and decide whether you're a perfectionist or not. And then clearly there is some sense in which these technologies give us this immediate advantage and then take it away again because they deliver us into a different kind of problem. And this is clearly happening on all sorts of levels. And that's perhaps why people like me, who make arguments in The Rational Optimist that, the percentage of people living in poverty in the world has gone in my lifetime from 60% to 9%. Why aren't we celebrating that? Is because it feels like however much progress we make materially, the world is still a terrible treadmill. And, email is great because you can send a letter and get a reply within half an hour. but it's also horrible in the sense that someone sends you an email at 10 o'clock at night that keeps you up, keeps you awake because you're worried about it, or whatever it might be. So, yeah, I think you're dead right that the Red Queen has a lot to say about all this. It's nearly 30 years since I wrote that book, so it probably needs revisiting in the light of new technologies. Good idea.
Great plan. But I want to come back to that point on progress there. So yes, overall, human history has gone generally up and to the right. But there is a sort of sense that at the edges, at the margins, the people who already had it all in the 80s, their quality of life is not, that's basically when you wrote the book, right? So at the point you wrote the book compared to now, which is enough sort of most of us will be able to sort of imagine that time frame. Have our quality of lives really improved since then? And I've got a small daughter. I was born in the 80s, and I look at her life and I look at mine, and we're in around about roughly the same sort of socioeconomic sort of demographics. So it's not like if we compare, it's fair to make that comparison. And if I look at her quality of life compared to mine, I can't really think of any dimensions that her actual quality of life has improved compared to mine. And I think that this is the challenge, where it sort of marries both the idea of progress together with the idea of being stuck on a treadmill, and that we can kind of measure progress on two dimensions. We can measure it in terms of distribution, and we can measure it in terms of leveling up. What we've really seen when we start to look at, like, Factfulness is another one of those books that go into it in your work too. What we've really seen is a distribution of progress gains that were made quite a long time ago across vastly wider swaths of the global population. And this is a good thing. And the same thing plays out in the economic field, where we can kind of see that international inequality has declined, even at the same time as sort of intranational, it's increased. You know, we have made progress in getting the stuff that only the most elite people in society had across to everyone else. But what has changed compared to, say, sort of 200 years ago, or the time when poor Rockefeller was around and died of a penicillin cut? You know, like, we all have a better quality of life to what he had. But at some point, that leveling up seems to have flattened off. And the only real progress we've really made is in distribution, certainly over most of my lifespan. Now, if you go a bit further back in time, we had more vertical increases. So the way I try and explain this is, like, we've stopped adding levels to the human experience, but we've got better at distributing the levels that we have. And that sort of distribution has disguised a lot of the running faster and staying in place, because we can point to metrics and say more people have running water now, childhood poverty has declined. And even the living or the lifespan question, I do have questions about, because we had people that lived to 120 years, even in sort of biblical times, right? So we haven't really added levels at the top, but we have got better at distributing those levels across society. So overall, sort of, lifespans have increased, okay, maybe decreased a little bit because of COVID, but, we're sort of tending to the over 60s, even in sub-Saharan Africa, where I am. But we do seem to have slowed down at adding real progress. I know we've spoken about some of those reasons today, but I think that's a chewy question to get into. That's not to say there's not work to be done. And we're going to see most of those metrics continue to improve as we continue to just distribute the gains that we had in the 80s. But I really do have questions that I spend a lot of my time thinking about the future as to, have we really reached a point where there's nothing really left to improve, right? I mean, like, we have more leisure time. We've achieved Keynes's sort of 4-day work week if you take it across the course of your life. I mean, we've done that because we start work later, we retire earlier, and we have shorter days in between. We've sort of achieved all this stuff, and taking much more work away at this point actually just makes us sadder, not happier. Adding an extra couple of years at the end of our lives at great cost and expense, against sort of running faster and faster to just get the sort of marginal returns at the end. Even there, where people are most excited about the biological increases, I do have questions. And I don't think that the progress is destined to stop. I think we can do better. But I think for many of the reasons we've spoken about today, the way science is progressing, the lack of ability to agree on anything, the lack of ability to question or to challenge, the status quo, we should be concerned about real stagnation going forward, because of course past performance is no guarantee of future returns, and we have to keep on running on that treadmill, or we're going to go backwards, never mind not even be able to move forwards.
There's a lot in there that I agree with, but there's quite a lot in there I disagree with. At last, we found something we can have a big row about.
Fantastic.
Because I think you're a bit too patronizing or dismissive of the distribution of these benefits. I think it's a wonderful thing that people have running water and electricity and don't die of malaria to the degree they did, as it were, and that's more important than that you get to have, 2 private jets, for example. Do you see what I mean? So the fact that if it's true that we've spent the last 50 years distributing the gains that technology has delivered to us in terms of longer lifespan, in terms of less infectious disease, in terms of more income, in terms of more food to poor people, and yes, it's dramatically true that poor people have got rich faster than rich people over the last few decades, particularly in Asia, but increasingly now in Africa. If that's true, it's wonderful. It's great. It's far better than that we were living in a world which quite a lot of history looked like, where the rich got richer and richer, but the poor didn't get richer at all. Because, sure, that's a bit of a straw man. I've distorted.
No, I agree with you. I
saying.
do agree with you. Do agree with you. That is where the real gains are being made, and real gains are better than imaginary gains. So, like the birds in the hand, roasted and cooked to feed everyone, is definitely better than sort of looking at the next evolution of the plumage.
And just on lifespan, there's a really interesting feature here that I'm fascinated by, which is that average lifespan is going up dramatically, 5 hours a day, roughly globally, which is an amazing thought. But extreme lifespan is not. This Jean Calment, the person who broke the record,
may or may not have.
Well, exactly. It looks like she swapped her birth certificate with her daughter.
With her daughter. Who knows? Yeah.
And so let's
let's
cut her out. We occasionally get someone past 115, 116, 117. I think might even be a 119-year-old alive at the moment, but basically not. There's been hardly any increase in the number of so-called supercentenarians, people who get past 110 in the world. It looks like we've found a sell-by date on human lifespan that we just can't do something about without genetic engineering, as it were. That's good news from the pension industry's point of view. If we can all live to 100 and then die healthy, that would be great. Unfortunately, we're not achieving that. We're getting more people past 90, but they're generally in worse health for longer than they would have been, which is not great. So there's, the health span is not increasing at the same rate as lifespan. But at the end there, you said something about stagnation that I do want to agree with. You say, well, hang on, are we really delivering technological progress that benefits everybody, or are we just distributing stuff? And I think to some extent you're right. I don't think we're living in an innovation, a time of innovation, a feast of innovation. We're living in a famine of innovation. We're living at a time when we're not innovating fast enough in the technologies that really make a difference to people's lives. If you leave the digital stuff on one side, which is a big if, I admit, then we've not been able to improve, the speed of transport, for example. Airplanes cross the Atlantic at the same speed as they did when I was a boy. That's pretty weird. Well, there's that, yeah. But my grandparents lived through. They were born before the motor car. They were born before the airplane. They died with men on the moon, rockets in the sky, supersonic planes in the air, helicopters whizzing around. They saw incredible changes. I've seen no similar changes. Yes, there are drones now, which there weren't when I was a boy. But apart from that, I can't think of any transport technology that wasn't there. Yes, there are more cup holders in cars, and yes, they're safer, but it's not, it's not that big a change.
You still sit in traffic. You still sit in traffic.
And even more sit in traffic. Exactly. And so
you literally slow down.
Yeah, and that's part of my in a book I wrote 2 years ago called what is it called? It's called How Innovation Works.
Yes.
I rather lament the fact that we're not taking innovation seriously enough. We're not encouraging it. We're allowing vested interests to get in its way, to lobby against the rules that would allow it to happen, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a bit worrying. We could be heading for diminishing returns in technology. if we don't, we're running out of room on Moore's law, which has delivered these incredible digital improvements over the last 50 years. If we don't allow innovation to thrive, maybe we won't be able to push the envelope, give people better living standards to the extent that we would like to. But one final point, back to my disagreement with you. There's a lovely thought experiment that my friend Don Boudreau did. He said he was in a seminar once. He was giving a seminar, and he knew that in the audience there was a billionaire. Now, if he didn't know who the billionaire was, could he have told just by looking at him? And the answer was no. The guy wasn't taller, he wasn't fatter, he wasn't he was wearing chinos. He had a Rolex on, but so did several people. There was a private jet parked outside, but so what? That's a luxury, not a necessity. This guy was no more likely to escape diseases of various kinds than the people to his left or right. So what we've done is we've pushed most of the inequality in wealthy Western societies into luxury rather than necessity. The guy to the left of the billionaire was not going hungry in the morning. Yes, he might have eaten at McDonald's rather than a five-star restaurant, but frankly, that's a pretty minor difference in terms of quality of food. Still getting protein, still getting all the things you need. So that's quite a nice thing to think about, is that when people go on and on about equality, Bill Gates is worth $1 gazillion. It can't buy him any necessities that other people can't get on the whole. It can only buy him luxuries.
That I absolutely agree with, and that is a good point. But there's also like an underside stat that I do think of as well, coming back to my concept of distribution. So yes, we have done very well over the last 100 years of distributing real improvements in human life. Things like the washing machine for mummy rather than having to wash clothes by hand. Things like children actually reaching adulthood. Those are important things to have been distributed across society. And we should celebrate those gains. I know I was probably a little bit flippant when I spoke to it, but I think that's because the follow-on, the sort of logical conclusion that you get to at that point is, once we have everyone up to that level that you're talking about, in that we can't really tell the difference in, your basic lifespan, your basic, like, you're going to sleep at night, you're going to have 3 meals a day. Once you've covered those sort of basic distributions of progress, we are in very big danger of distributing our unnecessary heavy peacock tails to those people too. And I know this is also one of my sort of less popular points that we get to, in that, and I'm working now at the moment in the play and earn gaming space, the same conversations coming up that my mother used to have about feminism in the 80s. This concept of there's a difference between the right to be able to work and the obligation to be able to work. And the rights to be able to work in order to feed your family and to take part in those distributive gains we've spoken about is a wonderful thing. However, the obligation to participate on a Red Queen treadmill doing bullshit jobs for no reason, for no actual improvement in gains, real gains in your life, when you get to the point of that conference room where the difference between the person who's probably working 12 hours a day and some meaningless job doesn't look any different to the billionaire in that conference room in that moment. But those gains, do we really want to be distributing them? And yes, we're not there yet. There's still a whole lot of real problems that we can do better with the redistribution. But I do wonder about that. I do wonder what happens to society once we're all on the treadmill and we're all running nowhere fast, writing longer and longer blog posts about tea and hard-boiled eggs in order to maintain our position. I do wonder about that. And I think a lot of science fiction has been talking about that at the moment too. Things like the hedonic treadmill and replacing the conversations around microdosing, all part of this conversation. The conversations around escaping into the metaverse are all part of this conversation of like, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do next? Or do we just keep running faster and faster, doing more and more meaningless tasks? Anyway, that's clearly I'm lots of fun at parties.
I think it's a really good topic. I still think that the guy who 100 years ago was working a 60-hour week rather than a 40-hour week, had no retirement, started work at 14, and no pension, and basically, worked underground or in a heavy manual labor and ruined his health doing so, is worse off than the person in a boring job in a call center today, which is not great, I agree, but it's not as bad as that.
Not as bad.
Who works a 39-hour week and gets to retire at 65 and was in college until they're 25, etc. And therefore only spends about 10% of their life at work when you do the math of their total lifespan, including sleep and everything like that. So I don't think it's as bad as we sometimes make out. That's another case of our taking for granted the improvements that have happened and ours.
We have much better problems.
Exactly. And, so, we shouldn't sort of dwell on these things too much. But, the other point of being a rational optimist, that's the name of one of my books, is that I'm not here to say the world is perfect. Quite the reverse. The whole point is that it's a vale of tears compared with what it could be and what our grandchildren are going to experience if we allow innovation to flourish, and what we'll deny them if we don't allow it to flourish. So, this is the very opposite of Panglossian. Pangloss said everything's fine. We can't make the world any better because God made it and God makes things perfect. So this must be as good as it gets. And if 60,000 people die in Lisbon in an earthquake, is what Dr. Pangloss said in Candide, that must be a good thing. They must be bad people. Voltaire is satirizing this ridiculous Leibnizian theodicy view. I'm here to say the opposite. Let's make sure we don't stop here and regard this as the best we can achieve, because I think we could have 9 billion people living on the planet in 2050 with much higher living standards and much more rainforest, and cleaner air and cleaner water, and not all exactly.
That's a great point to leave this conversation. And you got to be a rational optimist. I like that. I call myself a reluctant optimist because I do tend towards the cynical if I'm not fully aware of what I'm thinking and what I'm doing, which is why I've got to talk to people like you to balance off some of the edges. And you're right, we need to be very grateful for where we have got to, but we should not be taking it for granted, because the last couple of years, the absolute debacle of what's happened with the whole origin and spread of COVID should give us all a pause for thought, in that we have to keep asking questions. I think that's...
Bronwyn, can I ask you one question? Does it ever worry you that what you and I are doing now might not be any use to humanity, and that actually there's only about 10 people in the world who are making the world work, and the rest of us are all writing blog posts or doing podcasts? And that actually...
What's that?
Sorry.
That's true. This is a good question. This is, in fact, the conversation I'm having, not via blog posts or via a Substack, which is on vogue at the moment, but rather I have started writing to a few very select friends and stranger friends across the world about these exact points, in that the questions to life, the universe, and everything, right? Which is
yes,
much bigger than any of this, and those conversations are important to have, and they're also important to have outside of the public domain, I think, because you have to kind of figure out this know thyself projects one-on-one, one day at a time. And there are no definitive answers to that either. It's a process.
Dead right. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for entertaining me. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.